This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you to Niall and Sietske for inviting me to be here today, and thank you for coming to listen. I'm speaking today about translators in the context of the early Royal Society. The paper has its genesis in a question that I was interested in because of my background in English literature, and it's about the relationship between translations of what we would think of as literary texts in the 17th century and translations of what we might think of as scientific texts, and I use the word loosely to cover a multitude of philosophical texts. Obviously the 17th century in England was a great period of heroic translation, with great poets like John Dryden producing very serious translations of the classics in poetry. But they were also questioning the theory of translation as well, and Dryden and others were writing about how closely the translation should follow the original work. And my question today really stems from that, and whether that had an influence on the way that people translating scientific texts were thinking about their original and their translation. And so that's the background for this paper. In fact, I've come to the conclusion that for various reasons, possibly for different reasons from those of literary translators, the translators of scientific texts were not necessarily as faithful to the source text as we might have expected them to be. Instead, they made sometimes radical interventions, and it's been really nice to have Sven and Yolanda and Niall speaking earlier today, because their papers all speak to some of the things that I'll be talking about in my paper as well. And the fact that these interventions were made in the translations of scientific texts, I think, tells us a lot about the scientific milieu in which they were produced and consumed. And it's this contextual question that I'd like to concentrate on today. So I'm asking the question, why did the fellows make translations of particular texts, and what did they expect to do with them? And what does this tell us about the way that knowledge was constructed and transmitted? Of course, these are very large questions, and I'm not going to answer them in a 25-minute paper, but hopefully will stimulate some conversation. My talk's going to begin with a brief discussion of institutional practice at the early Royal Society, and Niall has introduced us to that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what role translations had in meetings of the Fellows of the Society. I think the Royal Society in this context is a very interesting case study, and a very useful one, because the institutional records of the Royal Society show us something which literary scholars and historians often miss, which is evidence of the reception of texts. So in the minutes of the meetings, we have a good record of how translations were received and dealt with. I'm then going to turn briefly to printed translations by fellows and others, and through an analysis of their prefaces rather than the actual texts, discuss their approaches to translation. Obviously we need to treat prefaces to printed texts with a note of caution, because of course that is the way that the author is trying to present his or her text, but they do tell us something about the theory that the translator is applying to the work. Thanks to Niall's discussion, I don't need to introduce Henry Oldenburg to you, and in fact, although he was one of the key translators of the early Royal Society, I'm going to deal more with the period following his death, which was unfortunately a great blow for the Royal Society in 1677. As Niall has explained, Henry Oldenburg dealt with a large proportion of the Society's correspondence, and the fellows were bereft without him. So it threw up some quite interesting problems. So to begin with translation in practice at the early Royal Society meetings. The Royal Society's motto was, and obviously still is, nullius in verba, which the Society today tends to translate as take no one's word for it. Despite the early Royal Society's avowed emphasis on oral and visual forms of communication required for demonstrations of experiments and discussions of observations at public meetings, they were still very much bound up in the world of written texts, as people like Adrian Johns have shown. And of course, some of these texts were written in languages other than English, which usually meant that they needed to be translated before they could be presented to fellows. So what happened to these translations? And I'm just going to briefly go through some of the practices that applied to all the texts that came into the Royal Society. So, and some of these things have been discussed by Niall, but basically texts could come into the secretary and then they would be read out at meetings, as we've seen. There would be discussion of the letters or the papers that were sent in, and this discussion was often recorded to various levels of clarity in the minutes of the meetings, which we still have. The letters and papers could then be copied into formal register books or letter books, so there was a clear copy of the letter made, but the originals were also often archived as well. So we often have two copies of the same text in the archives. They could then be taken out and reread at later meetings, and this often happened if a fellow hadn't been present, asked a question at the following meeting, the same text could be brought out again and discussed again. And then, of course, they could be published in the Society's journal, the Philosophical Transactions. So several iterations of this information could take place, and the texts could be met in various different contexts, both in an oral context and also a written context, with accompanying explanation and possibly demonstration. So sometimes these texts could be accompanied by experiments or microscopic demonstrations being done on the spot. And it's interesting to think what this might mean for the translator of these texts. So was, for example, verbal accuracy less important if a translation was accompanied by a physical demonstration of what the text was describing? Or if discussion following a verbal translation meant that there was time to adjust this translation in the light of listeners' comments. So, for example, we had Henry Oldenburg possibly just translating letters off the cuff. Possibly there was less impetus on him to get it exactly right in that context if he knew that he would then be able to revise that for publication. The minutes of the meetings provide interesting insights into the context in which translations took place and the uses to which the resulting texts were put. And I'll give just two examples here of a translation made and a translation requested. The Society was intermittently interested in fossilised wood. In May 1663, after a long discussion of the formation of minerals and petrifaction, Robert Hooke was asked to inspect a specimen of petrified wood provided by Jonathan Goddard. And then some months later, a table made of fossilised wood was presented to the meeting. And the fellows requested that further tests be made of this material, this time involving chemical analysis as well as the microscopic analysis that Hooke had previously subjected it to. And it was at this meeting that Thomas Henshaw was desired to produce his book that treats of the lignum fossil, or to give an extract of what is there discoursed of. So the book that was referred to here was Francesco Stelluti's tract on fossilised wood, which had been published in Rome in 1637, and which would have been quite a rare volume in London 30 years later. And at a meeting in the following year, Thomas Henshaw read out his translation of Stelluti's Italian tract, and also presented a copy of the tract itself to the Royal Society's library, and there is still one there, hopefully the same one, I expect so. And this was a gift from Sir Robert Paston, who was an otherwise really uninvolved member of the Royal Society and was actually expelled several years later for not paying his fees. So if you looked at his activity in the minutes, you would say that he'd really done nothing for the Society, but in fact here we see him delivering to them a quite interesting and useful text. Henshaw's translation included Staluti's explanations of the fine illustrations which accompanied his treatise, which suggests that the images were presented at the meeting and were discussed there. Although the work was obviously deemed relevant to the ongoing investigation, the minutes of the meeting don't record any further discussion of Henshaw's translation, but it was copied into the archives, and it remains there today. So on this occasion, translation was just one of several investigative methods brought to bear on the problem of fossilised wood. Along with the observations and anecdotes of various fellows, the material samples produced by Goddard and Ent, Hooke's microscopic observations and other tests, and Robert Boyle's chemical analysis, Henshaw provided a further source in terms of Staluti's tract itself and the linguistic skill to unlock it. Other translations were requested in a similar way at meetings, but with mixed results. And in 1667, there was a request for a translation of Merian's book concerning the Alps, because the fellows were having a discussion about the glaciers, and this was one of the first works to describe them. And on this occasion, Mr. Haak, who was Theodore Haak, a German fellow residing in London, was desired to translate this book of Merian into English for the use of the Society, which he promised to do. But unfortunately at the following meeting, Mr. Haak, being put in mind of his late undertaking to translate Mr. Merian's book out of the High Dutch into English, reported that he had a son-in-law now dwelling in that country, from whom he could procure a more exact description than he thought the book might afford. And he promised to write for an account as soon as he could. So I think we see here that it's possible that Haak didn't have time to translate the book, but on the other hand, it seems more likely that they felt that an eyewitness account of the glaciers would be preferred over the printed description, and the translation of Merian was not referred to again by the Society. So these are just a couple of ways in which translations could be incorporated into early meetings of the Society, but I think they do point to some wider considerations. As Niall discussed in terms of Oldenburg's letters, there's a strong emphasis here on utility and topicality. The translations were prepared or requested to support current investigations, and no doubt this had an impact on the nature of the translation produced or not produced in the case of the inquiries about glaciers. The presence among the fellowship of those skilled in foreign languages was an asset to the fellows, as was knowledge of foreign books and their availability in London via networks of gentlemen collectors. And the ability to call on these men with these types of expertise was a strength of the early Royal Society that can be overlooked if we judge involvement merely by experimental activity. So to move on to the analysis of the prefaces of printed texts, many of these do have some kind of preparatory material at the beginning, signalling the translator's intentions for the volume or giving the reader further information about the text. As might be expected, translators gave a number of reasons for presenting particular volumes in English. Scarcity of the work was cited regularly, often linked with expense. So some of these books were extremely, well, they were both rare, but they were also extremely lavish productions which weren't necessarily available to the general reader. And I think it's interesting, really, in this context to think about where these translations were targeted as well. Were they targeted to a more general reader, or were they themselves lavish productions that were going to a high-end market? And I think many of those produced by the Royal Society did fall into that category. But one of those that was translated was Claude Perrault's Memoirs for a Natural History of Animals, which you'll probably remember. Alexander Pitfield, who translated it, explained that the original had been printed so magnificently and curiously that the volumes seemed not designed for common sale and were only available as presents from the French king or the French Academy to persons of the greatest quality. So it was difficult even to see a copy of this book in Paris, where it had been produced. And this, he pointed out, rather defeated the purpose of the French Academy's efforts, most of the learned being totally deprived of the singular advantages that might be obtained therefrom. So the Royal Society there is presenting itself as this sort of purveyor of knowledge, making knowledge a bit more accessible for people. Other translators stress the benefits of making their text available to a wider audience, or more particularly to an English audience. And in this case, it's books about trades, about mining or other undertaking, medical books, and I think Merritt's translation of Antonio Neri falls into this category. And in this case, translators were often keen to see English practitioners emulate or surpass foreign efforts. And so the translation of Lodwig de Beels's tract on the preservation of bodies led Robert Boyle to suggest that if this was translated into English, then it might provoke Englishmen to follow a similar path and do the same kinds of research, or even better research than the Dutch were doing. And it might inspire people to put money into the scientific enterprise, which at this stage was just very in its very beginning. So this was quite a key text then. Translators were usually keen to emphasise the authority of the original text or their own translation, or both. And this was linked with the question of why particular texts had been chosen to translate. Clearly, only the most reputable of foreign authors should be naturalised into England. As might be expected in a Royal Society context, translators stress the knowledge and experience of the original author, and also in particular any personal connections that the author had with fellows of the Royal Society. So you come across comments such as Peter Witch, who translated a description of the River Nile, which says that the original text had been collected by Sir Robert Southwell, who was a fellow in Lisbon, and it had been procured from an inquisitive and observing Jesuit at Lisbon who had lived many years in Ethiopia and the Indies. And so Southwell had been in communication with a chap called Hieronymo Lobo, and Lobo himself was a correspondent with the Royal Society in the form of Oldenburg, in fact. So there's this quite a sort of closed loop of people who the readers would recognise the names of. Statements such as these tie author, translator and readers into the same philosophical community and provide additional weight to the resulting text. The translation is a link with practitioners of experimental learning across national boundaries, and this can particularly be seen in the case of translations of volumes originally produced under the auspices of foreign academies, like the History of Animals. Translators are careful to retain and to point out in the preface these connections. So Pitfield, who's been mentioned, and also Richard Waller, who was also mentioned earlier, and who translated the work of the Accademia del Cimento, both gave the foreign academies very fulsome praise in their prefaces. And I think in the same way that the Royal Society gave its imprimatur to various volumes that were published both by its fellows and under its name, so the foreign academies did, and the Royal Society, or the translators here, are sort of taking on some of that that imprimatur and extending it to the translation. And I think by extension as well to the Royal Society's philosophical endeavours more generally. As you probably know, there was quite a lot of debate about the usefulness of this natural philosophy, and I think the Royal Society was using sometimes these foreign publications to say, look, other people are doing this too, it's not just us, you know, this is really useful stuff, and here are some books to prove it. So having explained why they'd chosen to undertake a translation of a particular philosophical text, a number of translators turned to the question of how they'd gone about their task. On the whole, those who discussed this question tended to agree with Alexander Pitfield's method in translating Perrault. And he says, "I have used my utmost endeavours for the rendering of a faithful translation thereof, still keeping as near as I could to the true sense of the French copy, and varying as little therefrom as the nature of the English language would permit." And various other translators make similar statements that they're going to translate word for word, they've been more careful to do right to the author's words than to his style, and etc. But then other translators allow themselves to be slightly more flexible while keeping that underlying intention of faithfulness. So Joseph Moxon, who translated Vignola's work on architecture, claimed that he'd followed Vignola's words as near as he could, unless here and there I have been a little more large, thereby endeavouring the better to express his meaning. And Martin Lister explained that he'd jettisoned the comments of Dutch painter and entomologist Johannes Godart's previous translators, which he calls mere rhapsodies, and had printed the author's words only, but with a few additions of his own. So despite their basic commitment to a faithful translation, most translators did admit to making some changes to their original texts. And these ranged from apparently minor clarifications or insertions of extra text to major revisions, additions or deletions. So Christopher Merritt, despite his initial aim of translating Antonio Neri word for word, which he states he's going to do, decided that this was undesirable, partly because of Neri's tediously repetitive style, but also in a business wherein so little hath been said. So he's saying, well, you know, this is a new topic, and he informs the reader that he'd delivered whatsoever is material that I have met with in any good author concerning whatsoever Neri treats of, that thou mightst have together all that is substantially written upon this unusual subject. And I've supplied some things defective in our author, or very fit to be known to curious persons. So it seems that the translators were looking at the source text as a kind of bag in which to put more information about the topic than was originally necessarily present in the text. I will talk a little bit more about the additional material, just in that it wasn't always necessarily changes to the text. There was often an additional separate part, and I think we saw that a little bit with what Yolanda was showing us with the title page of the translation of Galileo, that text could be slightly repurposed or readjusted in this way. And so Salisbury was obviously including various different texts into a single volume. He was retitling them, which again is a change that has quite a big effect on the way that the reader perceives the text. And other authors included, for example, end material such as dictionaries or lists of words, which added their own discussions of the text under consideration. I should finish up here, but this has been quite a brief overview of the Royal Society's translation practices. But to answer my original question about why translations were produced and their function, I want to point out three aspects. They were useful for institutional practices. As we've seen at the Royal Society meetings, translations formed part of a set of tools used to attack particular problems. And I think also in the way that the translation was made and then copied out and then discussed and then possibly published in the Philosophical Transactions, this sense of reiteration and sort of chewing over the material, I think, formed part of the digestion of it, to use a metaphor. They were useful in publishing and promotional practices, and I think if we think a little bit more about the economics of book publishing in the period, that some of these translations were very lavishly printed volumes designed to impress contemporaries, and they're both demonstrating the usefulness of the new philosophy by translating medical works and instruction manuals, etc. But they're also demonstrating the international nature of experimental philosophical circles. And then finally, they're quite useful in a personal way as well, and I've talked a little bit about the way that people could help the Royal Society by providing translations, even when they weren't particularly scientific themselves. So a lot of these people were not what we would consider to be practicing scientists, and yet they had a skill that they could put to work in the service of the philosophical community. And I think that when we're thinking about the history of science, that's something we should take into consideration. So the requirement for faithful translations of early modern philosophical texts was explicit, and I think we've seen this with Robert Boyle's very keen control over Oldenburg's Latin translations of his works. Mistakes and misinterpretations could be economically, socially and intellectually costly for the whole community of producers and consumers. And yet this did not necessarily lead to word-for-word translations. There were a range of methods employed, and some translators did keep close to the text, but many allowed themselves the same latitude that literary translators advocated and took when dealing with Greek and Latin authors. They incorporated new material, their own or gleaned from other authors. They provided commentaries, dictionaries and explanatory notes. They repackaged and reformatted texts, divided them into sections and included new tables of contents, and they cut out unwanted parts of their originals. Like contemporary translators, they did this in order to make their materials suitable for an English audience. They were clearly aware of the tension between the expectation of a literal translation and the fact of deviation from the original, because they discussed their emendations in their prefaces to the printed translations. I think I'll finish there. Thank you.